Why is Africa poor? Today, we're diving into a topic that's both complex and deeply emotional: the poverty that continues to grip much of Africa. This isn't just an economic issue, it's a story shaped by history, politics, culture, and global systems. Africa is home to 30% of the world's mineral resources, boasts the second largest tropical rainforest on Earth, and holds an incredible cultural diversity with over 1,500 languages spoken across the continent. Yet, over 40% of its population lives on less than $1.90 a day. Why is that? In this short documentary, we'll explore the historical scars of colonization, the resource curse, the impact of weak governance, and how external systems like global trade and debt have played their part. But we'll also uncover stories of resilience, innovation, and hope that prove Africa is more than its challenges. It's a land of potential. Let us know if you enjoy this type of content and would like to see more in-depth explorations on topics that matter. You can even help shape the conversation by suggesting ideas in the comments below. What's your vision for the future of Africa? Share your thoughts. We're listening. Chapter 1: A continent with a stolen birthright. Imagine a vast land teeming with gold, diamonds, oil, and fertile soils, resources so abundant they fueled the dreams of empires. This is Africa, the cradle of civilization. It's where humanity first walked the earth, where the mighty Nile River nurtured ancient Egypt, one of the earliest and most advanced civilizations in human history. Africa wasn't just a repository of raw materials, it was a hub of intellectual and cultural brilliance. In West Africa, the Mali Empire reached its zenith under Mansa Musa, who in the 14th century was so wealthy that his pilgrimage to Mecca destabilized economies across North Africa and the Middle East simply by the amount of gold he distributed along the way. The cities of Timbuktu and Gao became renowned centers of learning, home to universities and libraries that housed texts on science, mathematics, and philosophy. Meanwhile, the Songhai Empire, which followed Mali, developed complex administrative systems and vast trading networks that stretched across the Sahara. In southern Africa, the Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe was a testament to architectural ingenuity, with its impressive stone structures and thriving trade routes linked to the Indian Ocean. Further east, the Swahili coast was a bustling hub of trade, connecting Africa to Arabia, Persia, and India long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. Africa was never isolated. It was a vibrant participant in the global economy. But all this changed when European powers arrived, driven by a thirst for wealth and domination. The transatlantic slave trade began in the 15th century, and over the next 400 years, an estimated 12 to 15 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands. Families were torn apart, villages decimated, and entire societies left without their most productive members. This human tragedy wasn't just a loss of people, it was a loss of knowledge, culture, and potential. By the time the slave trade was abolished, Europe's appetite for Africa had only grown. At the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, European powers, including Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, sat around a table and divided Africa like a pie, with no African representatives present. Borders were drawn without regard for the ethnic, linguistic, or cultural realities on the ground. Nations were split apart, while rival groups were forced to coexist within artificial borders. For example, the Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda were grouped together, laying the groundwork for future tensions. The Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani in Nigeria, each with distinct governance systems and cultures, were pressed into a single colony under British rule. Colonial rule wasn't just about political control. It was about economic exploitation. Europeans established systems of forced labor to extract Africa's wealth, from gold in South Africa to rubber in the Congo. Under Belgium's King Leopold II, the Congo Free State became one of the most brutal examples of colonial greed. Millions of Congolese died under forced labor conditions as they harvested rubber, a resource essential to Europe's industrial revolution. At the same time, traditional industries and knowledge systems were deliberately undermined. Colonizers introduced monoculture economies, where countries were forced to focus on a single export crop or resource, such as cocoa in Ghana or coffee in Kenya. This dependency on raw materials left African economies vulnerable to global price fluctuations, a problem that persists to this day. Education was also restricted. In many colonies, formal schooling was limited to a small elite class who would serve as intermediaries between the colonizers and the local population. This ensured that the majority of Africans were excluded from positions of power and influence, further entrenching inequality. By the time Africa began to gain independence in the mid-20th century, the damage was done. Colonialism had disrupted centuries-old systems of governance and trade, stripped the continent of its wealth, and left behind borders that were a source of division rather than unity. The scars of this era run deep, shaping the struggles and aspirations of modern Africa. This deeper dive highlights the magnitude of what Africa lost during the colonial period, not just its resources, but its people, knowledge, and systems of self-reliance. It also underscores how these historical injustices laid the groundwork for many of the continent's present challenges. Chapter 2. The Wounds of Independence. When the colonial masters finally left in the mid-20th century, they didn't leave a blueprint for success. Instead, they left economies engineered to serve the colonial powers, designed to export raw materials like cocoa, coffee, gold, and oil, while importing expensive finished goods. This structural imbalance ensured that even as African nations gained political independence, their economies remained tied to the interests of former colonizers. It was a system designed for dependency, not self-sufficiency. Leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah envisioned a different future. Nkrumah championed the idea of Pan-Africanism, arguing that Africa could only thrive if its nations united to harness their collective strength. Patrice Lumumba, Congo's first prime minister, had similar aspirations, calling for economic independence to match political freedom. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania pushed for Ujamaa, a model of African socialism that prioritized rural development and self-reliance. But these dreams of unity and self-determination were under constant attack. External forces weren't done interfering, and independence proved to be a fragile thing. The Cold War's shadow. The 20th century's great ideological struggle, the Cold War, made Africa a battleground. The United States and the Soviet Union, eager to expand their spheres of influence, poured money, weapons, and political pressure into the continent. They weren't interested in Africa's development, but rather in using African nations as pawns in their global chess game. In Congo, Patrice Lumumba's push for a truly independent nation made him a target. The United States and Belgium, fearing Lumumba's perceived alignment with the Soviet Union, backed his political rivals. Within a year of Congo's independence, Lumumba was overthrown, imprisoned, and assassinated in 1961, an event that left the nation mired in decades of instability. Meanwhile, in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, Cold War rivalries fueled devastating civil wars. The US and USSR armed opposing factions, prolonging conflicts that destroyed economies, displaced millions, and drained resources that could have been used for development. The rise of dictatorships. As the Cold War intensified, coups became commonplace across Africa. External powers often played a decisive role, propping up dictators who promised loyalty over democracy. For example, Mobutu Sese Seko in Congo, later Zaire, was supported by the United States as a bulwark against communism. Mobutu's regime looted billions from the country, while its people languished in poverty. Hastings Banda in Malawi and Nasingbe Eyadema in Togo were similarly backed by Western powers, despite their authoritarian rule and human rights abuses. This pattern was not confined to Western influence. The Soviet Union and its allies also backed authoritarian regimes, such as Ethiopia's Derg government, which presided over one of the deadliest famines in modern history. Internal challenges. While external interference was a significant factor, internal issues also played a role. Many African nations lacked the institutions needed to manage their new independence. Colonial governments had deliberately excluded Africans from administrative, legal, and technical education, leaving a critical skills gap. The rapid handover of power created a vacuum, and without strong institutions, corruption thrived. Elites often prioritized personal enrichment over national development. Infrastructure projects, education, and healthcare were neglected as public funds were siphoned into private accounts. Additionally, the artificial borders drawn by colonial powers forced together diverse ethnic and linguistic groups, creating fertile ground for ethnic tensions. In countries like Nigeria, Sudan, and Rwanda, these divisions led to violent conflicts that further stunted growth. Economic dependency and debt traps. Even as African nations sought to assert their independence, many found themselves caught in economic traps. During the 1970s and 1980s, Western financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank extended loans to African countries to fund development projects. These loans often came with strict conditions, requiring nations to cut public spending, privatize industries, and open their markets to foreign competition. The results were devastating. Governments slashed spending on education and healthcare, deepening poverty. Local industries, unable to compete with cheaper imports, collapsed. By the 1980s, many African nations were drowning in debt, forced to divert resources away from development to service loans. Dreams deferred. The combination of Cold War meddling, weak governance, and economic exploitation left Africa's post-independence leaders struggling to realize their dreams. The unity and progress envisioned by Nkrumah, Lumumba, and Nyerere were repeatedly undermined by a system that seemed determined to keep Africa down. The promise of independence began to wither under the weight of these challenges, but the story didn't end there. Even amidst the setbacks, seeds of resilience and hope were being planted. Today, as we reflect on these wounds, it's crucial to remember that they were not self-inflicted. They were the result of a global system designed to marginalize Africa. But they are also a reminder of the strength and determination of a continent that continues to fight for its rightful place in the world.